On January 24, 1984, Apple Computer Incorporated introduced the Macintosh personal computer, later retroactively renamed to the Macintosh 128K model. The operating system of early Macintosh is named Systems Software, or System, and its ensuing series was later renamed to Mac OS. The Macintosh platform is generally credited with having popularized the early concept of the graphical user interface, the main recognizable aspect of Mac OS. The original Macintosh Systems software was partially based on the Lisa OS, previously released by Apple for the Lisa computer in 1983. As part of an agreement allowing Xerox to buy shares in Apple at a favorable price, it also used concepts from the Xerox PARC Xerox Alto, which Steve Jobs and several other Macintosh team members has previewed. Mac OS has been pre-installed on almost every Macintosh computer sold, and has been sold separately in retail stores until being distributed exclusively online. Early history, development. The Macintosh project started in late 1979 with Jeff Raskin, who envisioned an easy-to-use, low-cost computer for the average consumer. In September 1979, Raskin began looking for an engineer who could put together a prototype. Bill Atkinson, a member of the Apple Lisa team, introduced Raskin to Burrell Smith, a service technician who had been hired earlier that year. In January 1981, Steve Jobs completely took over the Macintosh project. Jobs and a number of Apple engineers visited Xerox PARC in December 1979, 3 months after the Lisa and Macintosh projects had begun. After hearing about the pioneering GUI technology being developed at Xerox PARC from former Xerox employees like Raskin, Jobs negotiated a visit to see the Xerox Alto computer and Smalltalk development tools in exchange for Apple stock options. The final Lisa and Macintosh operating systems used concepts from the Xerox Alto, but many elements of the graphical user interface were created by Apple, including the menu bar, pop-up menus, and the concepts of drag-and-drop and direct manipulation. Unlike the IBM PC, which used 8 kilobytes of system RAM for power on self-test and basic input-output system, the Mac ROM was significantly larger and held key OS code. Much of the original Mac ROM was coded by Andy Hesselt, a member of the original Macintosh team. He was able to conserve some of the precious ROM space by interleaving some of the assembly language code. In addition to the ROM, he also coded the kernel, the Macintosh toolbox, and some of the desktop accessories. The icons of the operating system, which represented folders and application software, were designed by Susan Kerr, who later designed the icons for Microsoft Windows 3.0. Bruce Horn and Steve Capps wrote the Macintosh Finder, as well as a number of Macintosh system utilities. Apple was very aggressive in advertising their new machine. After it was created, the company bought all 39 pages of advertisement space in the 1984 November-December edition of Newsweek magazine. Apple was so successful in its marketing for the Macintosh that it quickly outsold its more sophisticated predecessor, the Lisa so much so that Apple quickly developed a product called MacWorks, which allowed the Lisa to emulate Macintosh systems software through System 3, by which time it had been discontinued as the rebranded Macintosh XL. Many of Lisa's operating system advances would not appear in the Macintosh operating system until System 7 or later. The system wasn't called Mac OS until the company began licensing clones and needed a clear product name for the OS. Release. The first version of Mac OS is easily distinguished between other operating systems from the same period because it does not use a command line interface. It was one of the first operating systems to use an entirely graphical user interface or GUI. Additional to the system kernel is the Finder, an application used for file management, which also displays the desktop. The two files were contained in a folder directory labeled System Folder, which contained other resource files, like a printer driver, needed to interact with the system. System 1, 2, 3 and 4. These releases could only run one application at a time, though special application shells such as Servant, Multimac, or Switcher could work around this to some extent. System 1.0, 1.1, and 2.0 used a flat file system called Macintosh File System. The Finder provided virtual folders that could be used to organize files, but these were not visible from any other application and did not actually exist in the file system. System 2.0 added support for AppleTalk and the newly introduced Laser Writer to use it. System 2.1 introduced the HFS, which had real directories. This version was specifically to support the hard disk 20 and only implemented HFS in RAM. Startup and most floppy disks remained MFS 400K volumes. System 3.0 was introduced with the Mac Plus, officially implementing HFS, 800K startup drives, support for several new technologies including SCSI and Apple Share, and trash bulging. System 4.0 was released with the Mac SE and System 4.1 first shipped with the Macintosh Euro. These new machines required additional support for the first expansion slots, the Apple Desktop Bus, internal hard drives and, on the Mac 2, color, larger displays and the first Motorola 68020 processor. Changes in early Macintosh operating systems are best reflected in the version number of the Finder, where major leaps are found between 1x, 4x, 5x, and 6x. System Software 5. System Software 5 added Multi-Finder, an extension which let the system run several programs at once. The system used a cooperative multitasking model, meaning the time was given to the background applications only when the running application yielded control. A change in system functions that applications were already calling to handle events made many existing applications share time automatically. Users could also choose not to use Multi-Finder, thereby sticking with using a single application at a time as in previous releases of the system's software. System Software 5 was the first Macintosh operating system to be given a unified Macintosh system software version number, as opposed to the numbers used for the system and Finder files. It was available for a very short time and only in some countries, including the United States, Canada and some European countries. System Software 6. System Software 6 was a consolidation release of the Mac OS, producing a complete, stable, and long-lasting operating system. Two major hardware introductions requiring additional support under System 6 were the 68030 processor and 1.44 MB SuperDrive debuting with the Macintosh iX and Macintosh SE/30. Later, it would include support for the first specialized laptop features with the introduction of the Macintosh Portable. From System 6 forward, the Finder would have a unified version number closely matching that of the system, alleviating much of the confusion caused by the often considerable differences between earlier systems. System 7. On May 13, 1991, System 7 was released. It was a major upgrade to the Mac OS, adding a significant user interface overhaul, new applications, stability improvements and many new features. Its introduction coincided with the release of and provided support for the 68040 Macintosh line. The System 7 era saw numerous changes in the Macintosh platform including a proliferation of Macintosh models, the 68K to Power Macintosh transition as well as the rise of Microsoft Windows, increasing use of computer networking and the explosion in popularity of the Internet. Perhaps the most significant feature of System 7 was virtual memory support, which previously had only been available as a third-party add-on. Accompanying this was a move to 32-bit memory addressing, necessary for the ever-increasing amounts of RAM available to the Motorola 68030 CPU, and 68020 CPUs with a 68551 PMMU. This process involved making all of the routines in OS code use the full 32 bits of a pointer as an address. Prior systems used the upper 8 bits as flags. This change was known as being 32-bit clean. While System 7 itself was 32-bit clean, many existing machines and thousands of applications were not, so it was some time before the process was completed. To ease the transition, the memory control panel contained a switch to disable this feature, allowing for compatibility with older applications. One notable System 7 feature was built-in cooperative multitasking. In System Software 6, this function was optional through the Multi-Finder. System 7 also introduced aliases, similar to shortcuts that were introduced in later versions of Microsoft Windows. System extensions were enhanced by being moved to their own subfolder. A subfolder in the System folder was also created for the control panels. In System 7.5, Apple included the Extensions Manager, a previously third-party program which simplified the process of enabling and disabling extensions. The Apple menu, home only to desk accessories in System 6, was made more general purpose. The user could now make often used folders and applications or anything else they desired appear in the menu by placing aliases to them in an Apple Menu Items subfolder of the System folder. System 7 also introduced the following: Apple Script, a scripting language for automating tasks. 32-bit Quick Draw, supporting so-called true color imaging, previously available as a system extension. And True Type, an outline font standard. The trash, under System 6 and earlier, would empty itself automatically when shutting down the computer or, if Multi-Finder were not running, when launching an application. System 7 re-implemented the trash as a special hidden folder, allowing files to remain in it across reboots until the user deliberately chose the empty trash command. System 7.1 was mainly a bug fix release, with a few minor features added. System 7.1 was not only the first Macintosh operating system to cost money, but also received a Pro sibling with extra features. System 7.1.2 was the first version to support PowerPC-based Macs. System 7.1 also introduced the system enablers as a method to support new models without updating the actual system file. This led to extra files inside the system folder. System 7.5 introduced a large number of new features, many of which were based on shareware applications that Apple bought and included into the new system. On the newer PowerPC machines, System 7.5 may have had stability problems partly due to a new memory manager, and issues with the handling of errors in the PowerPC code. These issues did not affect 68K architecture machines. System 7.5 was contemporary with Apple's failed Copland effort as well as the release of Windows 95, which may explain Apple's purchase of several shareware system enhancements to include as new system features. Mac OS 7.6, stability improved in PPC Macs with Mac OS 7.6, which dropped the system moniker as a more trademarkable name was needed in order to license the OS to the growing market of third-party Macintosh clone manufacturers. Mac OS 7.6 required 32-bit clean ROMs, and so dropped support for every Mac with a 68000, as well as the Mac 2, Mac iX, Mac iICX, and Mac SE/30. Version history: System 7.0, System 7.0.1, System 7.0.1p, System 7 Tuner, System 7.1, System 7.1p, System 7.1p1, System 7.1p2, System 7.1p3, System 7.1p4, System 7.1p5, System 7.1p6, System 7.1 Pro, System 7.1.2, System 7.1.2p, System 7.5, System 7.5.1, System 7.5.2, System 7.5.3, System 7.5.3L, System 7.5.3 Revision 2, System 7.5.3 Revision 2.1, System 7.5.4, released very briefly and withdrawn within hours. Replaced by 7.5.5, System 7.5.5 last to support non-32-bit clean Macs, including all with less than a 68030 CPU except the Macintosh LC. Mac OS 7.6, Mac OS 7.6.1 proper PowerPC error handling introduced. Mac OS 8. Mac OS 8 was released on July 26, 1997, shortly after Steve Jobs returned to the company. It was mainly released to keep the Mac OS moving forward during a difficult time for Apple. Initially planned as Mac OS 7.7, it was renumbered 8 to exploit a legal loophole and accomplish Jobs' goal of terminating third-party manufacturers' licenses to System 7 and shutting down the Macintosh clone market. 8.0 added a number of features from the abandoned Copland project, while leaving the underlying operating system unchanged. A multi-threaded Finder was included, enabling better multitasking. Files could now be copied in the background. The GUI was changed in appearance to a new shaded grayscale look called Platinum, and the ability to change the appearance themes was added with a new control panel. This capability was provided by a new Appearance API layer within the OS, one of the few significant changes. Apple sold 1.2 million copies of Mac OS 8 in its first 2 weeks of availability and 3 million within 6 months. In light of Apple's financial difficulties at the time, there was a large grassroots movement among Mac users to upgrade and help save Apple. Even some pirate groups refused to redistribute the OS. Mac OS 8.1 saw the introduction of an updated version of the hierarchical file system called HFS+, which fixed many of the limitations of the earlier system. There were some other interface changes such as separating network features from printing, and some improvements to application switching. However, in underlying technical respects, Mac OS 8 was not very different from System 7. Mac OS 8.5 focused on speed and stability, with lots of old 68K code replaced by modern code native to the PowerPC. It also improved the appearance on the system, although the theming feature was cut late in development. Mac OS 8.0, Mac OS 8.1, Mac OS 8.5, Mac OS 8.5.1, Mac OS 8.6, Mac OS 9. Mac OS 9 was released on October 23, 1999. It was generally a steady evolution from Mac OS 8. Early development releases of Mac OS 9 were numbered 8.7. Mac OS 9 added improved support for airport wireless networking. It introduced an early implementation of multi-user support. Though not a true multi-user operating system, Mac OS 9 did allow multiple desktop users to have their own data and system settings. An improved Sherlock search engine added several new search plugins. Mac OS 9 also provided a much improved memory implementation and management. AppleScript was improved to allow TCP/IP and networking control. Mac OS 9 also made the first use of the centralized Apple software update to find and install OS and hardware updates. Other new features included its on-the-fly file encryption software with code signing and keychain technologies, remote networking and file server packages, and much improved list of USB drivers. Mac OS 9 also added some transitional technologies to help application developers adopt some OS X features before the introduction of the new OS to the public, again easing the transition. These included new APIs for the file system, and the bundling of the Carbon library that apps could link against instead of the traditional API libraries. Apps that were adapted to do this can be run natively on OS X as well. Other changes were made beginning with the Mac OS 9.1 update to allow it to be launched in the classic environment within OS X. This is a compatibility layer in OS X versions prior to 10.5 that runs a nearly complete Mac OS 9 operating system, allowing applications that have not been ported to Carbon to run on OS X. This is reasonably seamless, though classic applications retain their original Mac OS 8/9 appearance and do not gain the OS X Aqua appearance. Mac OS 9.0, Mac OS 9.0.2, Mac OS 9.0.3, Mac OS 9.0.4, Mac OS 9.1, Mac OS 9.2, Mac OS 9.2.1, Mac OS 9.2.2, OS X. OS X/EOS/18/ is the line of graphical operating systems developed, marketed, and sold by Apple Incorporated, which succeeded the original Mac OS, which had been Apple's primary operating system since 1984. Unlike the earlier Macintosh operating system, OS X is a Unix-based operating system built on technology developed at Next from the second half of the 1980s until early 1997, when Apple purchased the company. The first version was OS X Server 1.0 in 1999, which retained the earlier Mac operating system's platinum appearance and even resembled OpenStep in places. The desktop-oriented version, OS X, followed in March 2001, supporting the new Aqua user interface. Since then, 7 more distinct end-user and server versions have been released. In July 2011, OS X v10.7 was released with new features, such as Launchpad, which is a springboard-style home for applications, similar to the iPad, iPod and iPhone. And Mission Control, a functionally improved replacement for exposure copyright. Releases of OS X up to v10.8 are named after big cats. For example, Apple calls OS X v10.5 Leopard, while its previous release was called Tiger. Starting in v10.9, releases will be named after places in California. On June 2, 2014, Apple introduced OS X 10.10 Yosemite at Worldwide Developers Conference 2014. Versions of OS X: OS X v10.0, OS X v10.1, OS X v10.2, OS X v10.3, OS X v10.4, OS X v10.5, OS X v10.6, OS X v10.7, OS X v10.8, OS X v10.9, OS X v10.10, Timeline. See also, AUX, Apple DOS, Apple GSOS, Apple LisaOS, Apple ProDOS, Apple SOS, Apple Computer, Incorporated v. Microsoft Corporation. Comparison of operating systems, history of the graphical user interface, inside Macintosh, list of Macintosh software, notes. Further reading, Linsmeyer, Owen. Apple Confidential 2.0. No Starch Press PPA 284 Euro 288. ISBN A1-59327-010-0. External links, older Macintosh systems software from Apple.com, bibliography. A list of links to the history of GUIs, Apple Macintosh before System 7. A comprehensive guide to Mac OS software releases prior to System 7. OS X history on Mac Timeline.